There we are. Looks like YouTube is kicking in. Just about ready. All right. Okay, it is 7:01. We're going to start here in just a second. Just had to get that extra drink of tea in. All right. Good evening to everyone on Zoom, YouTube, or however it is you are choosing to study. We are coming to the end of Masechet Mikvaot. We are picking up in chapter 10, Mishnah number 6, which, as you'll be able to see easily by flipping through the pages, is not very far from the end of the Masechet. We will be finishing this section very, very soon. But do not despair. This is not going to be just a 10-minute class. Obviously, we'll make time for questions and discussion, but I have also taken the liberty of preparing a little additional material that is on topic. One is a description from the Art School translation of this Mishnah that has a discussion of how modern mikvaot are often made, and two, a little essay as well from them about the issue of tum'ah, of ritual impurity. So that will be also, I think, very useful, and of course, very useful as we prepare for, next week's class, which is going to be on Nida, which is continuing our discussion of purity topics. So don't worry, we've got plenty of material for today. So let's go ahead and dive in. That we're running out of time for making mikvah jokes. Sorry. So Mishnah 10, chapter 10, Mishnah number 6. So here we are, as Dr. Kolp is pointing out, talking about a very important process of purification of water that has become ritually impure, something that we'll talk about in our Tuma section. Now, water is very important here because only impure water can be rendered pure. Other liquids that have been rendered impure, again, which we'll talk about more in our Tuma section in our other tabs, only water can actually be brought through this process. If it is a different type of liquid, then once it is rendered impure, you're done. That liquid is now impure. Water, on the other hand, can be rendered impure, but there are a couple of caveats and particular conditions through which that process happens. And that's what we're going to look at here in Mishnah number 6. And the term that is going to be sort of subliminally put through all of this is kissing, this neshika of the water that is in the container and the water that is in the mikvah. So it's when the two come into contact. Now, why is this a topic? Why is this at all a bit of an issue? Well, you have to put yourself in mind not of water and not of the water of the mikvah, but think instead about two different substances plus a container. For example, think of sugar and think of flour. Now, imagine I have a giant bowl full of sugar, a huge bathtub full of sugar. And then I take a big scoop of flour in my, giant measuring cup. Now, the flour in the measuring cup and the sugar that's in the bathtub, they are two separate things. And if I bring that measuring cup down into the sugar in the bathtub, and I push it all the way down, shimmy, 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 get it into there, and the top of the sugar touches the top of the flour inside the measuring cup, would we say that the measuring cup has been completely immersed in the sugar? We would not, because the flour is blocking the sugar from reaching all of the inner walls of that measuring cup. So there is an inherent issue when you are immersing a vessel that is full of something else, that some other substance is going to prevent the waters of the mikvah from reaching its inner surfaces. Not so when the vessel is full of water itself. That's the topic here, that if the vessel is full of water itself, then once the water inside the vessel just touches the water outside the vessel, then they are considered linked, and boom, the immersion has been complete. That is the general idea. But we're going to see there was a little debate first between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, and a little debate about quantities. But that's the basic idea of what we are talking about. Okay, so Beit Shammai says, hot water may not be immersed in cold, or cold and hot, foul and fresh, or fresh and foul. So Beit Shammai is basically saying, look, if you're going to use this leniency that water touching water become linked and they have then a unified status and one is not blocking the other, then you need to at least have the same kind of water, the same temperature or the same quality of water. If one of them is yuck and the other is great, or if one of them is hot and the other is cold, then really they still feel like they are separate waters. The hot water inside my bucket that I put into the mikveh still feels hot, even though it has touched the cold water of the mikveh. And if they still feel separate, then come on, can we really have the leniency here of saying that they are one and they are now touching all the surfaces? Well, Beit Hillel says yes, it may be immersed, meaning that the immersion will still work because once it is touching, it is touching, it is water, done, full stop, the immersion is complete. And as usual, Beit Hillel wins this argument. Now, the second issue is a vessel full of liquids, which one immersed. It is as if it has not been immersed. So here we are moving away from water and we're moving to other liquids. So we have wine, or we have juice, or some other form of liquid that is inside your bucket. And you dump the bucket into the mikveh, and the surface of the mikveh and the surface of the liquid inside your bucket touch. Tough. Nothing has happened. The liquid that is still inside is blocking the mikveh water from reaching all of the bucket. The bucket remains in whatever purity status it was before it went into the mikveh. That is the general rule for all of the things except for water. Unless if it was full of urine. This is reckoned as water. So yes, the sages did argue that for the technical purposes, for halakhic purposes, that the water that leaves the human body is the same as water in general. And thus, if it touches, it is not a barrier to the water from the mikveh touching all of the surface of the vessel, and it doesn't stand in the way. And as such, yes. Now, does this mean you should be using buckets full of urine in the mikveh? No, that's not what the rabbis are talking about, as we've often had to remind ourselves. Instead, the rabbis are simply trying to clarify the technical status of this water. Now, that technical status of the water is going to be important in the next section here too. If it contained chatat waters. Now, what are chatat waters? Well, chatat waters is the technical term for the water that has been mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. The red heifer is is burnt. The ashes are mixed with water, and that is used to remove the ritual purity that comes from contact with the deceased. So the chatat waters are a special mixture of water, if you will, that has been prepared for that purpose. So I have my bucket, and it has the waters that have been prepared for using for that ritual, and I am putting it into the mikveh. Now, you have to ask, why would I need to do this? Well, chatat waters famously, the whole process of this purification process is very counterintuitive. Famously, even Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, did not understand all of this and could not reconcile all of it. But basically, although these waters will make a person ritually pure that had become impure from contact with the deceased, it will render the person doing it and itself in its container ritually impure. So it makes something that is impure pure, and it makes something that is pure impure. So the chatat waters clearly are an unusual category, and obviously their container is going to have this impure status, which is why we are probably bringing it to the mikveh. But the waters are still in it. What happens? Well, it is unclean, the container, unless the waters of the mikvah which enters the vessel exceed the chatat waters. So rather than having our standard, like we did at the beginning for normal water, of just kissing being enough to render it all clean, here we actually are looking at proportions. That if the bucket is 1/3 full of chatat waters, and 2/3 of the rest of the bucket is filled now with water from the mikvah, because it goes under the surface, then yes, we consider that to overwhelm the chatat waters, and now it is cleaning, purifying, whatever word you want to use, rendering tahor the entire bucket and contents. Oh, well, the rest of the water is just now gone. So that is the basic process. But if there is 2/3 of your bucket full of chatat waters, and you put it in and only 1/3 is left to be filled with the waters of the mikveh, sorry, that is not enough. The mikveh waters have to exceed the chatat waters in order for anything to take place. Otherwise, the chatat waters retain their cohesion, their status, and they block the mikveh waters from reaching the rest of the vessel. Yes, Aaron.
Sorry, I hope I'm not getting ahead, but is there a difference between purifying the vessel versus purifying the water? I meant the water in the vessel.
So generally speaking, you can't actually purify the water distinct. It's the vessel that is usually the object that is being purified. Food and liquids don't really get made pure. Water is a bit of an exception here, only because the water coming into contact with the mikveh is essentially being mingled with the mikveh. And so now the water no longer has a separate identity. But if you just had a self-contained, no bucket quantity of wine that had been rendered unclean, and you drop that into a mikveh and then you bring it out again, sorry, that wine is still ritually impure. So we'll talk about a lot more of the issues with different degrees of impurity and what can render something impure when we get to our postscript tonight, when we talk about Tumah in general. So you're not ahead of yourself, but I'll save the full discussion for later. And then Rabbi Yosei has his own analysis. He says, even if a vessel with the capacity of a kor, which is huge, contains a quarter load, that tiny amount, it is as if it had not been immersed. So Rabbi Yossi says, I don't care about quantities. If there is liquid in it, then that liquid cannot be overwhelmed by the mikveh, and because it is still a barrier between the item and the waters of the mikveh. He's not going for commingling here at all, not going for dispersion. It's basically, if it's not empty, then the vessel cannot be rendered ritually pure through immersion. That this is just like we talked about, well, a few weeks ago. There is or last week we talked about still too. This is like a barrier. It would be like going into the mikveh as a person and having your hand covered in plastic. You would not have allowed the water to reach everywhere, and thus the immersion did not do its job. Make sense? Okay, like I said, Rabbi Yossi loses that argument. Mishnah number 7. All foods combine together to make up half of a half loaf, which makes the body unfit. All right, so we are changing topics here. And in usual fashion, the Mishnah didn't tell us we were changing topics here. But since we are finishing up with some of these purity issues, and we've already talked about liquids now, the Mishnah decided that thematically, for memory purposes, let's talk about food that could also render a person unfit. Now, when do we need to worry about these foods that render a person unfit? Well, basically, all of this is under the category of truma. Truma, you may remember, is the special food that was given to the Kohanim that had to be eaten while the food was ritually pure and the Kohen was ritually pure. So making sure that the body of the Kohen is ritually pure is rather important. And this is something that could be a problem. So if you are eating, and you are eating enough food from different types, a little bit of bread, a little bit of cheese, a little bit of fruit, whatever it might be. And together, if you were to add up all of the food you just ate, and it was a quarter of a loaf of bread, half of a half, which, as Dr. Kolb points out, is like 2 eggs worth of volume, then you have now become ritually impure for the purposes of eating truma. Now, you're not ritually impure for most other purposes. Again, we'll talk about that more in the end tonight, but you are ritually impure for eating any truma. You need to go through the normal purification process of immersion. So that's what we're talking about in the beginning. Part 2, all liquids combine together to make up a quarter log, which makes the body unfit. Same idea, but here we're talking about a quarter log. If you've drunk from multiple different types of liquids, each of which was impure, and the sum total of all of that is quarter log, then you are no longer allowed to eat truma until you have gone through the ritual process. And then part 3, just as a little bit of almost a footnote, this is more of a stringency in the case of one who drinks unclean liquids than in the case of the mikvah. For in this case, they have made all other liquids like water. You may remember that when we talked about various ways to disqualify a mikvah that is in the process of being filled, that only water can render the mikvah impure. That is to say, water that was drawn, as opposed to water that came from the natural source. Unlike other liquids, if I pour 5 gallons worth of fruit juice into the mikvah, it neither adds to the volume of the mikvah, nor does it disqualify the mikvah. It's just blech. Here, however, not only water, but other liquids as well can combine together to create that minimum of a quarter log that would render a person impure for the purposes of eating truma. So, like I said, this is kind of just a built-in footnote to the Mishnah, just to say, hey, look, sometimes things are a little bit different than you might expect. We're being more stringent in this than we are with how we fill the mikvah in the first place. Please note this, because your logic might have told you that it went the other way, but it doesn't. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, is the quarter log the amount for water to transmit impurity?
Let's save that for the discussion for more impurity issues when we get to the actual impurity tab. Because I want to stay on topic until we finish Mikvaot, which is right around the corner, Mishnah number 8. Okay. So now we're going to get into well, it's not very pleasant, because we've done kind of everything we need to do. We have talked about how to build a mikvah. We have talked about how to immerse a person in the mikvah. We have talked about the impurity of liquids. We have talked about the impurity of foods. Well, now let's combine the food and the person and the immersion. Let's bring all of it together, and it's going to get messy. So those of you that have a weak stomach, you might want to just fast forward for a little bit. If one ate unclean foods or drank unclean liquids and then immersed, right? He's doing what he's supposed to. He ate something that was unclean, but he needs to eat truma. So he goes to the mikvah and then vomited them up, meaning the unclean food or drink. So he went, he ate, he immersed, and then he comes out and then he throws up. They are still unclean because they did not become clean in the body. So the basic principle is that unless something has actually been absorbed by the body, its status within the body remains whatever its status was before it entered the body, before you ate it, before it came in. And that means that while you immersed, the water was rendering you pure, but it was not rendering the food in your stomach pure. That is still unclean. And when you vomit up, well, they are going to be unclean, because that's how they were when they went in. The waters of the mikveh don't reach them, and they don't transform them while they are inside your stomach. Now, once they've been broken down and dispersed within your body and become part of, your cells and all of the other good biology stuff, then yes, there's no issue there. Now it's you. It's not a separate thing sitting in your gut. But before that, when they're still eligible for being vomited, well, then yes, they are going to retain their independent status. And then he goes on, the Mishnah goes on to say, if one drank unclean water and immersed and then vomited it up, it is clean because it became clean in the water, in the body. So water, like we saw back up in the earlier Mishnah tonight, has a separate status. Water, once it has mixed within the body, is considered to now be part of the body. And that means once you immerse in the mikveh, the water is being immersed within you at the same time as your body is being immersed around it. So that water has now been transformed by the immersion. And when you throw up, the water is no longer unclean. Now it has the same status as your body. It is now clean. Okay, and just to make things even more complicated, if one swallowed a clean ring, meaning a ring which is ritually pure, and then went into the tent of a corpse, which, as we'll see in our Truma prologue today, is something that will render things even in the same airspace ritually impure. If he sprinkled himself once and twice and immersed himself, which is the process of the chatat waters, and then vomited it up, behold, it remains as it was before. Okay, so the ring was pure, you swallow it, you go into the tent, you become ritually impure, but then you purify yourself, and then you vomit it up. The ring still has the same status. The ring never changed its status. Obviously, as Dr. Cole points out, you probably want to wash it off, but it has not transformed its status, which is why if one swallowed an unclean ring, a ring that was ritually impure, he may immerse himself and eat truma, meaning that it doesn't actually make you unclean. The ring has its independent status sitting there inside your stomach. And when you eat, we don't worry that it is connecting to the truma that goes into you. Obviously, you still had to immerse yourself after touching it, because by touching it, by just going into your mouth, it rendered you impure, but it's not doing anything from inside your stomach. So once you have been immersed, you're allowed to act in a fully tahor way. You're fully pure. However, if after all of that you vomit it back up, well, it's still unclean in there. And that means as it comes up, it is coming into contact with you. And when you bring it out, now it is going to render you unclean again. So the ring is unaffected by anything you do, and you are unaffected by it and its status as long as it's inside you. But in the process of going in or coming out, then you can affect it and it can affect you. Make sense? By the way, just a little, disclaimer, please do not go around swallowing rings, because that's not a healthy thing to do. All right, and finally, we'll end on a slightly violent note. If an arrow was stuck into a man, it blocks, meaning the mikvah water, so long as it is visible. But if it is not visible, he may immerse himself and eat truma. Now, is eating truma the first thing on your mind after you've been shot with an arrow? Probably not. Right? You're probably thinking, ow, I've been shot with an arrow. Please get the arrow out of me. But we're not here to discuss the first aid or triage or battlefield, medicine. We're here to discuss the issues of ritual purity. So what's the issue here? Well, if the arrow is still visible, then that means that when it is sticking a little bit out of your skin, it is a separate thing that is also touching your skin, and thus it is blocking the skin. Think of it like, I wish I had 3 hands, right? You have the walls of the skin, and when the arrow hits it, it's going to bend those walls in, but it's also going to press against the walls of the skin. Well, that bit is no longer available to be, no longer exposed to the waters of the mikvah when you finally immerse. So that means the immersion does no good. You are still ritually impure. However, if the arrow goes in completely so that the skin can fold back up and it's covering the buried arrowhead, well, lucky you, now your skin is visible, and that means it can be it's exposed, which means you can immerse and you can go eat truma. You should still get the arrow removed. But as far as the issue of tameh tahor, of impurity, purity, you can effectively still immerse yourself. And that is where Mishnah Mikvaot chooses to end. A little bit of a downer, I know. Okay, any questions from tonight's Mishnah on Mikvaot? Okay, then let me just drag my little bar down here so I can see all of my tabs. Then we are going to get our bonus content. Woo! Okay, so we are looking here.
So, Rabbi, bottom line, everything is separate.
Bottom line, everything is separate if it's not actually in you, and if it's in you, then if it's been digested, it's part of you, and if not, it is still separate. Unless it's water. Water is considered to be part of you immediately. Okay, now, as I mentioned before, this is content taken from the ArtScroll translation and commentary on Mishnah Mikvaot. This is part of their appendix, and I thought it was a very good explanation of the construction of modern Mikvaot, and trying to see how this works in practice. As you're going to see, the modern way of making a mikvah is not at all the style that was discussed in the Mishnah. Not that it violates it, God forbid, but it is a more regulated, belt and suspenders, extra precaution style of preparation. Many of the issues that we've talked about will become very obvious, but we'll see how a modern mikvah gets made. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and just read this out because I find that an easier way to make sure we cover everything. In order to build a mikvah, one first needs a source of valid water, like we've talked about before. Now, in the modern time, the most obvious source would be the municipal water supply, which generally originates from lakes, rivers, or wells that are valid for use as a mikvah. I mean, after all, that's where our water comes from. That's why important preservation of our water supplies is absolutely critical for the future of civilization. But, however, in the treatment facility and in the transportation of the water, it passes through various pipes, meters, and tanks, causing a serious concern that the water becomes she'uvim, drawn water. So you may remember there was a lot of discussion about drawn water that you had scooped out from the well, and then you were pouring into the mikveh, and that was a big problem. But you may also remember that we talked about various pipes that can take the water from the roof and lead it down into a mikveh that could be acceptable. Well, in order to avoid that issue, because it's hard to track every single drop of water that comes through a modern water treatment plant, the modern solution is going to try and remove that from the equation, meaning not try to find reasons to accept the municipal water, the water that just comes out of the faucet, but instead find a different way to build a mikveh in the modern world. So, therefore, it is the prevailing halakha that tap water is not fit for a mikveh, and gives various modern sources for that interpretation. Thus, rainwater must be used by channeling it from the roof of the building. Now, they say rainwater, but technically any of the other sources that we've talked about could also potentially be used. It's just in many parts of the world, rainwater is the easiest to access for most facilities. Most people don't have lakes that are nearby in a convenient way to set up a filling of a mikveh. Care must be taken that none of the pipes that bring the water to the mikveh is considered a container, like we talked about in the Masechet. As for the mikveh itself, this is where it gets a little fancy. The simplest form of a mikveh is a simple pool that becomes filled with 40 seah of rainwater, like we've been talking about since chapter 1, a big hole in the ground, 40 seahs of rainwater, boom, you have a mikveh.
So still are using, sorry, Robert, still they prefer the raining than the pipeline from the regular water from the city.
Correct, absolutely. All modern opinions say that the water from the city is doubtful. It doesn't mean it's forbidden, and there is some discussion about whether it could or couldn't, under different circumstances, be used. But in order to make sure that a mikvah is 100% kosher by the widest number of opinions, we do not use the municipal water for the creation of the mikvah. We will use it for sustaining the mikvah, as we'll see, but we don't use it for the initial seed water, that first 40 seyas that are needed for the mikvah.
And what happens if you live in a desertic area that there's no rain?
Well, that's where we talked about before, of using things like ice that's been gathered from natural sources like lakes and such, and then shipping that to be used. That's to my knowledge how it's usually done in Southern California, for example, my old hometown. Okay, so now a simple mikvah, a big hole in the ground, right? Here we live in Florida. Water comes out of the sky all the time. Theoretically, you could just dig a hole in the ground and wait for it to be filled, or, well, not even filled, just wait for 40 seyas of rainwater, a couple hundred liters, as we've been talking about, and boom, now you can throw your hose in and fill it up with water from the tap, and you have a mikvah. And indeed, I should point out, there are many authorities that do suggest that in the modern world, in an area where it rains very frequently, a person or family may want to build a swimming pool and let the pool first gather a couple hundred liters of water from the rain, and then finish the process of finishing the pool off. And because of the rules of the mikvah, as long as it started kosher, and as long as it never goes down below that 40 seyas later on, you can continue to top it up again and again and again from the water tap, and it is still a kosher mikvah. So it is perfectly plausible in a rainy area like this to create a swimming pool that will also be a mikvah. However, not everybody lives in that area, and not everybody would have access to that. So when we talk about a community mikvah or an institutional mikvah, usually we build it a little bit more bulletproof to make sure that it is available for the community and will not have any of the potential problems that it might be for being in your backyard. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, what is the problem for just having a 40 seya mikvah in your shul? Well, practically speaking, this type of mikvah has a major drawback. The basic hole-in-the-ground mikvah has some problems. Eventually, through repeated use, the water in the pool becomes unclean. We're not talking about unclean for halakha. We're talking about unclean like yuck, right? This is 40 seyas of water that we've had hundreds and hundreds of people using. I'm not sure that I want to go back into that water again, right? That's just not a happy thought. It may be kosher, but it's not good. Additionally, there's the issue, like we talked about before, that if a person is coming out of the mikvah, they bring some of the water with them. If you're not careful, it's very easy for a mikvah like this to run low, and then you have to start all over again to refill it with the rainwater, which is a big pain. So after emptying, as it points out, after emptying the mikvah, one would have to wait for enough rainfall for the mikvah to once again fill with 40 seyas of water, of rainwater. Okay, so to overcome this difficulty, how do we fix this? Well, the modern mikvah is designed with at least 2 pools. Now, we're going to actually see a 3-pool diagram in a second. And for those of you that are on YouTube, I'll give you a quick glimpse that you can save for later. But we're going to start off with a simple 2-pool mikvah. It's not too simple to say. One pool, which we will call the reservoir, is filled with 40 seya of rainwater, right? Standard mikvah, we need to fill it with 40 seyas of rainwater. Once it's filled with 40 seyas of rainwater, it's great. Although this reservoir is a valid mikvah, it is not used for tevilah, for immersion, right? So this is a reserved mikvah. That's why he's calling it a reservoir. And I'll just do a quick picture on here again. That is, we have a regular mikveh here in the front with the stairs, and then there is a mikveh in the back. And that mikveh never has any customers. Nobody ever takes a dip in there. And we'll explain that of why that is. Rather, it is covered to preserve the water and keep it clean. So you've got this mikveh in the back that is perfectly, not sealed, as we'll see, there's a hole, but it is not going to be used as the main mikveh. Next to the reservoir and sharing a wall with it is another pool, which we will call the bath, in which tevila is performed. The bath is filled with water from the municipal water supply. So that it may be valid for tevila, the water of the bath is connected through an opening in the upper part of the dividing wall. The bath water thus becomes valid through hashaka. Remember, we talked about that idea of the flowing between a valid mikveh to another container, that as long as the valid mikveh has enough content, it can thus render the other container a valid mikveh as well. Since there are more than 40 seah of water below the opening to the bath, the reservoir will always contain 40 seah of water, even when the bath water is emptied and refilled. Thus, the bath water can be changed as often as needed. So let's take a look at the picture and I'll explain that. Ignore this mikveh over here for the moment. This is the more complicated cover all your bases version. So this version, just imagine for the moment, we have what's marked as B and C. We have the main bath, and then we have the reservoir mikveh. First, you let the water flow in from the rain gathering on the roof, comes down through the pipe, it flows along this edge, we'll talk about that in a second, and pours in and fills up reservoir B, at least the minimum of 40 seah. But most importantly, there is a hole in the wall between reservoir B and C, and that hole has to be higher than the 40 seah minimum that is needed in the reservoir B mikveh. Then you take your hose and you fill up reservoir C, the bath, and that, once it reaches the level of the hole, the pipe between the two of them, that then makes the connection, and reservoir C, the bath, is now also rendered as a mikveh. So at that point, I keep getting my terms confused, bath B, bath C can be used day after day after day. And when bath C gets a little dirty or needs to be cleaned, you can simply drain it all the way down. But when you drain it, you'll notice because of the hole, you're not draining reservoir B. Reservoir B will have at least 40 seahs, and most would be constructed with plenty more than that above or below the pipeline, to make sure that when you drain C, you're not emptying reservoir B below that minimum measure. And then you can clean out this whole area and then refill it with the tap water. And when it connects to the pipe again, it is being reconnected to that pristine mikveh that you keep in the back, reservoir B, and presto changeo, it becomes a kosher mikveh in the front as well, and we are good to go for immersions again. Does that make sense for the first type of modern mikveh? Not hearing any objections? All right, so let's take a look at...
Let me see if I understood right. Okay, can you show me again? So the mikveh is the mikveh is the C, correct? The B is your backup plan.
Right.
There are a whole connection between B and C that is higher than the minimum level. Correct?
For B, right. For B, yes.
No.
It has to be higher for the quantity in B.
So B is the one that need to have the correct amount of water, not C, B.
Correct. B is
C can be lower.
Well, C cannot be lower than the hole, because then it's not connected.
Correct.
So remember, B is the perpetual mikveh. B is the mikveh that is like protected to make sure that it is always okay. That's why nobody uses it directly. And it's only adding its purity through that hole to allow the front public bath area to also be rendered as a mikveh.
Yeah, but the question that I'm confused is that if you have a hole connect both B and C, okay, and C is dirty, the dirty water also go in the direction of B. It's not only from B to C. So also B become to be dirty, and it's not more the alternative mikveh.
Okay, so there is still that issue, exactly right, that the backup reservoir B is still, because it is connected, going to potentially be problematic, meaning that it is going to still be contaminated, not in the halakhic sense, but in the hygiene sense, with the contents of C. And that's one reason why there is also this other alternative that we're going to talk about. And that's what we're going to look at next.
So
A second option.
mikveh, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
Go ahead.
The mikveh of Ohev Shalom has 2 or 3 of these, or just one?
Actually, I haven't looked at behind the scenes at Ohev Shalom. So I can't tell you exactly which version, if they're using number 1, number 2, or the combination. We would have to go on a field trip.
What is number 1? Sorry.
Number 1. Well, as we're going to see, I keep trying to point to the screen, but I have to use my mouse. Number 1 is only using reservoir B and public bath C. Option number 2 only uses reservoir A and public bath C. Option 3 uses B, A, and C.
But A and B is not similar in the system.
Well, let me tell you. Okay, a second option, right? A second option, and this is the one that uses reservoir A. A second option also uses a reservoir which is filled with 40 seahs of rainwater. All right, so far it is normal, right? And we can see that in this picture, the rainwater pipe over here comes down and it flows into B or A, both of them getting filled by the rainwater. So far as expected. However, rather than filling the bath with water from the municipal supply, water is added to the water supply from the water supply to the reservoir. Okay, so let me go back to our picture. So here we fill up A from the bottom with rainwater that comes down the pipe and down that channel. Then we turn on the tap water with pipe D, which flows down and into that reservoir, making it much more than 40 seahs. Now, the water then, flip the page, overflows into the empty bath through a hole that is located high in the wall between the reservoir and the bath. The she'uvin is thus validated by being mixed into a valid mikveh, right? The water that comes in from the tap is mixed into a proper mikveh. Thus, that mikveh is kosher because it was already kosher, and you can always add she'uvin, drawn water, to a mikveh as long as it was already 40 seah or more. And then, once it has reached that overflow height, it pours out and fills up the bath labeled C. So rather than filling up the bath directly, we're filling up the bath by making the first mikveh A overflow into the bath through this very high opening.
This is much easier. That's much because you use a regular pipeline from the city, so it's easy work. And it's flowing all the time. So also because it's flowing all the time, it's clean all the time.
And this is based on the principle of Ziriya, which we talked about extensively throughout the Masechet. The bath can again be emptied when desired, that is to say area C, and the process of adding she'uvin to the reservoir repeated. Okay, it works perfectly fine. And like you said, this has the added advantage that the water is flowing down in, but there is no water from the public bath flowing up into the main reservoir. So like you said, for hygiene purposes, for making sure that none of the schmutz from the bath gets into the backup mikveh, this does seem like a pretty good system. However, in the modern world, we like to make things a little more complicated. The vast majority of authorities accept either method, right? Either version B or version A, both are accepted by most halakhic authorities as a valid method of creating a kosher mikveh. Nevertheless, some maintain that there are certain advantages in one method over the other, particularly with regard to complying with minority views. Common practice in the construction of mikvaot is to incorporate, when possible, various stringencies in order to comply even with the views that are not necessarily accepted as halakha. Okay, so welcome to 21st century, well, 20th and 21st century Judaism, where doing it the halakhic way is not enough. You have to do it in the halakhic way that also makes as many people as comfortable as possible, that you are covering all the bases of all the most obscure potential objections, even if those are not legitimate concerns in this issue. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, is the rainwater getting filled up from a pipe in the roof that goes down to either A or B?
Yes, basically that's what's happening over here with the pipe labeled E, that is a non-container pipe. And remember, we talked about that earlier in the Masechet of how to have a pipe that wasn't a container. And as you can see, it flows across this channel, and in this diagram into either A or B, basically equally. Now, so what do we end up with? For this reason, and in order to avoid certain potential pitfalls that could be encountered when using just one method, many mikvaot today are constructed using a combination of both methods. And that is what we are seeing here in our picture 4, mikvah 4 picture, which is a mikvah built to accommodate both varieties of stringencies in order that everybody might possibly be comfortable and no one could object, probably. Yes, Natan.
Why you need 3 if you can do the same super deeply complicated life for everyone with only 2? Because what happens if E is going to the A as well as D? So you have also the water for raining, also the water for pipeline going to the same place, A, and that's it. You don't need a B, because also A is receiving also the raining. So you are saving a lot of money in construction and making the life less complicated, because you have just another pipeline that, in addition to the D, is the municipality, you have also the E also going to the same swimming pool. So it makes much easier the life of everyone. No?
Yes, it could. Absolutely. I mean, I just want to be very clear that first of all, just to make sure it's really clear, the water from E comes in before any water from D is added. You have to have the rainwater come in and fill up 40 seahs first before anything else can get added. But you're right. Once you've got that 40 seahs, dropping the water in from the tap from the city for pipe D, you've got a kosher mikveh right here in A. Why do you need to have A and C, let alone why do you need to have A and B and C? To add on top of that, it is perfectly possible in the modern world, meaning like 20th and 21st century, to filter the water, that you can send the water of a mikveh through the same filtration process that you use for a pool. And just like you don't need to constantly empty your swimming pool, if you are maintaining it properly with filters and chlorine, you can also maintain a mikveh basically indefinitely, as long as you have built in the proper infrastructure to make sure that the mikveh will be hygienic the same way that you would for a public swimming pool. So yes, really, you don't need more than just a mikveh that has the water from the rain, that has been filled up by water from the city, that is then going through a filtering process. You should be able to put your steps right here, and that's your mikveh. Like I said, I mean, even a jacuzzi in a private residence could be turned into a mikveh in Florida pretty easily with this kind of procedure. as long as it's, big enough to actually qualify in the first place. I don't actually know what the standard size of a jacuzzi is. So yeah, that is, there are simpler ways to do it. And why are we not doing the simpler ways? Because there are people that would complain. There are people who would say, my rabbi taught me this, my yeshiva says that, I'm concerned, what about this, what about this, what about this? I remember somewhere there was an opinion in the 1800s that was concerned in Latvia. And in order to try and make all of those issues go away, it gets more and more complicated in the building of the mikvah. And that same strategy, applies to Shabbos regulations, to kashrut regulations, to family purity regulations, to many aspects of contemporary Judaism. It's one of the blessings of having our multinational and educational Jewish organizations all talking and all sharing their books and sharing their ideas. It's also the curse that now we have 1,000 new things to be concerned about that we weren't interested in before, because the basic halakha is pretty clear. And is that more of a blessing or more of a curse? Well, it depends on how much you allow it to inhibit your life and prevent you. So, I would say that if this level of complication tripled or quadrupled or quintupled the cost of building a mikveh for a community, then drop it. Build the simplest, basic, halachic mikveh that actually will do the job of a mikveh and be kosher, maintain it properly, and be done. And don't worry about trying to please everyone. And I speak especially as a conservative rabbi. I know that no matter how complicated or fancy a mikveh I built, that the Orthodox are not going to accept my supervision of the mikveh. So by the time it's done, even if it were built by an Orthodox company, by the time it's done and they leave, no Orthodox person is going to go into a conservative synagogue to use their mikveh. So we might as well build our mikvaot according to halakha, not according to someone else's standard. Yes, Aaron.
I have two questions, actually. One is, when the Orthodox don't accept it, how do they get the presumption that it's invalid? Because I thought any Jewish person could supervise it and give it the presumption of being valid.
So you're absolutely right. The general assumption, the hazakah, is that Jews are following Judaism. However, in the Orthodox world, and I don't speak for all of them, but I do speak for a large number of the most vocal and aspects of the leadership, begin with the assumption that if you have not aligned yourself with Orthodoxy, regardless of the technical steps you have taken, the actual deeds you perform, the very fact that you do not consider yourself Orthodox means you have already publicly declared that you are invalid as far as your legal decisions go. So if you did everything else, you were identical in every other way to an Orthodox person, but you say, but I'm a conservative or I'm a Reformed Jew, then by definition, everything you do from that point on would not be accepted.
So are you basically saying that these Orthodox branch considers non-Orthodox people Am Haaretz?
Yes, Am Haaretz is a very good term for it, although I will say that they are a slightly more generous to the congregants than they are to the leadership. For the congregants, they actually will often consider you as captive babies, that you were kidnapped by your parents and raised in this heretical variety of Judaism, and you don't know any better. And neither did they, and neither did their ancestors. But we wicked conservative or reform rabbis have stolen you and lied to you and deceived you, and you don't know any better. So you're not really that bad. You're just ignorant babies, as though you were captured by pirates. We, on the other hand, yeah, we are in much bigger trouble in their opinion.
And the second question is, let's say if they do have a different opinion in Lithuania, based on the Mishnah where Hillel and Shammai eat together, how effective, or what's the rule on accepting the mikvah in, let's say, America, even though you wouldn't accept it in Lithuania based on that Mishnah?
Okay, so in general, in Jewish law, there's like a wonderful discussion on the kashrut issue in Shulchan Aruch that I love to bring. If a neighbor has accepted a voluntary stringency, meaning that for them or their community, it seems like that's what they're doing, but they encounter a Jew, especially in their own home, meaning like their neighbor's home or in a different city, that follows a halakhically correct but different interpretation, you are supposed to allow yourself to commingle with them, like the waters of the mikvah. That's okay. A classic example in the modern world, if you have an Ashkenazic and Sephardic neighbors in Israel, where it's more likely, and one of them are eating beans and the other are not eating beans on Pesach, the Ashkenazic neighbor is absolutely allowed to eat at the Sephardic family's house. They don't eat the beans, maybe, but they can still eat from the pots that had the beans in it, etc. And so, yes, you are supposed to give that that cushion to each other. However, when it comes to the cushion of between movements, there is no cushion from the Orthodox side. They are not going to make an allowance for a conservative rabbi that did it right, even if it was just a little different than them. It's like, I'm really, really serious. They cannot get past that first word, a conservative rabbi. Once that happens, everything else is considered invalid. And you're right, that's not classical Jewish law. That's not classical Jewish practice. The Jews of Eastern Europe knew that many of the Jews of Western Europe were more lenient than them on many positions. They never considered the Jews of Western Europe to be heretical. They didn't want to adopt their practices. They had their own local customs and practices, but they didn't consider them heretical. But in their defense, well, not really in their defense, speaking most, what's the right word for it? It's trying to put the best spin possible on it. They would argue that while they recognize that traditionally, classically, Jews are supposed to make accommodations for each other's practices, in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, Judaism is under attack. It is going to die if you don't follow their version and call all others invalid. So in their opinion, it is a social necessity to rule out everything else that all the other non-Orthodox groups do, because the rest of us are killing Judaism. Now, are we really under more pressure now than we were during the Roman periods, during the Inquisition, during the Crusades? No, we are not. The famous book, The Jews Are the Ever-Dying People. We've always been under pressure. And there have always been people who wanted to be more lenient or less or more strict, and etc. But for a variety of reasons beyond tonight's lesson, since the 1800s and 1900s, the position of Orthodoxy has been everything else must be ruled as invalid in order to justify and stabilize their unique community. And yeah, there's a whole lot more to say about that, but I want to make sure that we have time to look at our Tuma reading as well, because this is a bit of a lead-in for our discussion of Nida, which starts next week. Okay. Okay, we've technically got 1 minute left. I think we might be going over just a little bit. Again, this is an intro. I'm not going to explain everything. I just want to get some of the information on the table. The laws of Tuma come up throughout the Mishnah. Indeed, the last of the 6 orders of Mishnah, Seder Toharot, is devoted entirely to this topic. That's where we are right now. Since these laws, unfortunately, do not play a significant role in daily Jewish life nowadays, as the temple is not standing, and most people are unfamiliar with them, we present here a short introduction to this very intricate topic. Tuma is a type of halachic impurity that attaches itself to people, utensils, and foods under certain circumstances, or as a result of special conditions. The laws of Tuma and its counterpart, Tahara, purity, are scriptural decrees, meaning they're in the Torah, whose roots cannot be understood through ordinary human logic and experience, taken from Rambam's Mishnah Torah. So Rambam tries to explain to us, and I absolutely agree, that we cannot simply reduce the laws of purity into a basic logical or experiential, empirical situation. These are their own unique thing. For this reason, their terminology cannot be simply translated. That's why I always hate when it gets translated to purity or cleanliness or unclean. It's just, it doesn't fit well. Therefore, we will use a number of Hebrew terms to explain the Mishnah's discussion of these laws, with which the reader must be familiar to follow the explanation of many Mishnahs or Mishnayot. The Torah classifies certain people and items as sources of Tumah. These include a human corpse, a nevilah, that's to say an animal carcass, except for that of a kosher animal killed through shechita, proper slaughter, a sheretz, which is the carcass of one of the 8 species of creeping things listed in Leviticus 11, verse 29-30, a zav. I will also point out zavad that they left off the list, a man or woman who experience emissions that resemble but are not identical to seminal emissions, a nidah, a menstruant woman, and others that are listed in the first chapter of Kelim. Each of these main sources of Tumah is known as an Av HaTumah, literally father of Tumah, except for a human corpse, whose more stringent Tumah is known as Avi Avot HaTumah, literally a father of fathers of Tumah, as Av HaTumah, and certainly an Avi Avot HaTumah transmit Tumah to people, utensils and foods and beverages that touch it or come in contact with it in various other ways. Okay, so those are the sources. Now, what things can become ritually impure? As mentioned above, there are 3 categories of things which can become tameh through contact with a source of tumah. People, utensils, meaning objects that have been fashioned in some way, such as chairs, dishes, lamps, or clothing, in contrast to blocks of wood, gold, clay, or random strands of wool. So there is the finished object, and finished is very nebulous for on purpose, and there are unfinished or raw materials. Also see, beverages are food that have become wet through contact with one of the 7 liquids: dew, water, wine, olive oil, blood, milk, or honey. These categories are subject to different levels of tumah, as will be explained below. Okay, and we pop over to page 3. Okay, so now we know what can cause it. Now we know what can receive it, what can be affected. How does this actually happen? Well, all main sources of tumah, avot hatumah, can transmit their tumah to other objects if one touches them, maga, right? Surface-to-surface contact definitely will transmit. Most avot also transmit tumah to one who carries them, even without touching them, masa. So if you're carrying a jug and whatever is inside of that is impure, usually that will also cause a transmission, or even causes them to be moved without touching or carrying them. Haset, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, later on. Avot hatumah, that are living persons, such as a zav or a nida, right, a person with this emission or the menstruant, also render tameh any bed, chair, etc. that they sit upon, right? This idea of mishkav or moshav. If you are lying on it, if you are sitting on it, then you can render it impure, even if it is covered and they do not touch it directly or move it. Also, the bed or chair, called midras, which we've talked about before as tumat midras, is an exception to the rule discussed above, because it itself becomes an av hatumah, a primary source of impurity, rather than a rishon, that secondary level, which we'll talk about in a second, and has the capacity to render people and utensils tameh, not only food and beverages as a rishon does. A human corpse, as well as certain parts of a corpse, can also transmit tumah through tumat ohel, which is rendered as tent tumah or roof tumah. A corpse renders people or objects tameh through tumat ohel if the corpse is in the same tent, meaning under the same roof as they are, or B, if the corpse forms a roof over them, they're literally underneath the ark of the corpse, or C, if they form a roof over the corpse, they are what is covering it. The details of these complex laws are discussed in Tractate Oholot, which is not for what we're doing next. That's going to be Nida again. Now, which items cannot become tameh? Well, live animals do not become tameh. Animal food not fit for human consumption also cannot become tameh, nor can anything attached to the ground, such as a tree or plant, become tameh. So if somebody falls dead in the middle of your watermelon patch, you remove the body, you bury them, obviously, the watermelons did not become impure just because they fell there. They cannot become impure until they are harvested and then also moistened, as we talked about before. Utensils made of stone or unbaked earth do not become tameh. So your stone slab or an unfired pottery. Flat wooden, excuse me, got to find my next tab. I went to scroll. Flat wooden utensils that have no receptacle or hollow in which something can be contained, for example, a wooden cutting board, also cannot be rendered tameh. Foods that have not been prepared, mukshar, for tumah by being wetted by one of the 7 liquids mentioned above, also do not become tameh. Now, these laws are the subject of the tractate Machshirin. Once they have been prepared, meaning once they have been moistened in the proper way or prepared for the food itself, they can become tameh even after they are dry, meaning once they are susceptible, they remain susceptible. Earthenware vessels, clay cheres, are unique in that they become tameh only if their inside or even their interior airspace is touched. Even if a corpse, which is, as we said, the most severe source of tumah, touches only the outside of an earthenware utensil, it remains tahor. Also, an earthenware utensil that is tameh transmits tumah only to objects that touch its interior. Now, how do you get rid of tumah? And this is, of course, going to be important when we discuss nida. Tumah is removed from people and most utensils that become tameh as a rishon through immersion in a mikvah. Earthenware utensils, however, cannot be purified of tumah. Foods and beverages other than water also cannot be purified of tumah. Tough luck, it's no longer ritually pure, but for most food and beverages, that's not a major issue for most people. It's a bigger issue if you are a kohen. After immersing in the mikvah, the person or utensil is known as a tuvul yom, one who immersed that day, and will no longer render tameh any food or beverages he touches. He may also eat maaser sheni, the tithing, second tithe, immediately after immersion. However, he still renders truma or kodesh, the truma food for the priests, or the kodesh, the food that comes from the sacrifices that he touches, tameh, until nightfall of the day of his immersion. So there is this buffer time. A person who is an av hatuma, such as a zav, or a person who touched a human corpse, requires additional procedures to remove his or her tumah. The procedures vary with each type of tumah, and sometimes include the bringing of offerings or the passage of certain time periods. The tumah of a non-living av hatumah, such as a nevela or corpses, cannot be removed. You cannot immerse a cow that was killed by a lion and make it ritually pure. It is always going to be ritually impure. So what is the consequence? Tameh persons and objects may not enter the temple, Beit HaMikdash. Truma, Maaser Sheni, and Kodesh foods that become tameh may not be eaten and must be burned. By contrast, Hulin, which means normal types of foods that become tameh, may be eaten, although some people were careful to eat only tahor foods, and tameh utensils may be used for ordinary, non-sacred purposes. So that is a little bit of an introduction, and I'm sorry for running late, but we will begin with the concept of nida next week on Wednesday. Thank you, as always, for joining me to study. I look forward to doing our next Masechah together, and Yasher Koach to everyone who came